the Turtle Tracks podcast. I'm your host, Brian VanHooker, and I'm here with Scott Hensey, who is responsible for a lot of the toys that you'll remember from your childhood. How you doing today, Scott?
Never better. Nice to be here with you, Brian.
Well, I appreciate it. I love talking to the toy makers because I feel like you guys are the ones that I don't know if overlooked is the right word, but people don't know who made these toys. So I really like sharing that. So I appreciate you being here with me.
Well, that's true. Most people, well, now it's different, but back in the day, people didn't even know where these toys came from. They thought you planted seeds or something. They had no idea that somebody was sculpting them.
It's true.
But it's interesting that it's getting so much attention now, I guess, because the kids who played with the toys have grown up. Sort of.
Oh, yeah, that's it for me. I grew up, I mean, I sincerely don't remember before I was a Turtles fan, although I do remember Raphael was my first Ninja Turtle. And then, they've just been part of my life forever. And now I'm curious and digging back as to who was part of every little piece of it. So that's why I wanted to reach out to you. So, I guess to get started, I wanted to find out how you first started making toys.
Well, I was considering myself art department as opposed to artist. In other words, I was trying to make a living doing whatever kind of art I could find people to pay me to do. So I did all kinds of things. I painted windows. I did screen printing. I did some ceramic ware. And then at some point I got a job at a company that made garden statuary. I was there because I could speak a little bit of Spanish, so I could direct the painter. Okay. Mas azul, por favor, you know. And then at some point, I made a crack to the art department, the art director there, that I could sculpt things better than these are. And he said, oh, yeah, well, and he gave me a chance. So I started doing sculpture for these outdoor planters and stuff for, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 years. Went on for a long time. I was just working piecework, like I do today. And then while I was working there, somebody called me and said, hey, I saw in the newspaper that there's a toy company that's looking for a sculptor. And I said, well, I've been sculpting. I haven't done any toys. It was Tomy Toys. You ever heard of Tomy?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Japanese toy company. And at the time, this was in Los Angeles, at the time they had a location in Carson. So I started working there. They hired me because I had this real diverse portfolio and I was willing to work for a bag of dirt. So they signed me on, and that's where I first encountered how you make toys, the clay and the silicone molds and the wax casting and the wax finishing. That's where I learned that. Then Coleco Toys, which was a company that had bought the rights to the Cabbage Patch dolls. They were looking for something to spend their money on. So they bought Tomy North America. Tomy Japan was still going strong, and they still are, but they bought North America. And since I've been technically working for the Tokyo office, even though I was in LA, they closed the DMV and dispersed us into the world. And that was right about the time, that would have been in about 85, 86, something like that. And there were a lot of sculpture jobs and not very many people sculpting, which is a pretty cool position to be in. So a friend of mine had gone to work for Playmates after Tomy went under. And he called me in to do a preschool toy called the Huff and Puffs. They actually did produce them, but I don't think they made very many. Anyway, I was bringing my pieces back and turning them in. And I said, okay, what's next? And they said, well, we just bought the rights to this character line called the Ninja Turtles. Do you want to sculpt some turtles for us? And I said, sure. But remember, I'm art department. I'll take any job that you got, right? Sure. So I said, yeah, turtles. I was familiar with the Underground Turtles comic because I was a big comic book fan, and Underground comics as well.
Oh, cool.
And the first Ninja Turtle comics were for grown-ups. And they were, they were a grown-up kind of sideways comic book. And I thought, well, they're black and white comics, and they're not very they're not really aimed at kids, and they're kind of a satirical comic. So I thought kids aren't going to get that, and they don't have any weapons, and they live in the sewers, and they say cowabunga, and they eat pizza. I mean, this is a real bad idea. But of course, I said, great, bring it on. But I asked them if I could do bad guys because they looked more interesting. Shredder and the Foot Soldier and those guys look more interesting than Turtles, which were all the same, or that's what I was looking at the time. So they said, sure, you go and do bad guy. So I did the Shredder and Bebop, the pig guy, Bebop, right?
Yep.
And the Foot Soldier, and I did a study for the other guy, the Rhino guy, but somebody else did that, kind of looking at my piece. Anyway, as you know, once they came out with them, they were a big giant hit. And after that, anything that was green and had a grimace, we could sell. So we were off making them as fast as possible then.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and I mean, it started out, we would do drawings and turnarounds and stuff, and then they were in such a hurry to get these things on the market because they were selling great. We were doing things from a phone conversation. What if there was a pizza chef whose one leg was cut off? Do that. Yeah, have it by Friday. So at some point, I mean, at that time, I was working in my garage. I was just doing, I was doing all of them. I was doing the drawings, and then the armatures, and then the sculpture, and the moldings, and the castings, and the urethane parts. I must have been painting too. Somebody had to do it, and I didn't have anybody on staff at the time. So yeah, I was doing all of those things. And then at some point, I realized that if I hired some help, I could get the pieces done a lot faster. And I was getting paid piecework, so that made sense. So I hired a few people to do the molding and casting. And then I hired some people who wanted to learn to sculpt, and I taught them to sculpt so they could help me. And kept that going for a long time. Then at some point, I know we're not here talking about Happy Meal toys, but at some point, I got to do Happy Meal toys for McDonald's when they first started doing Happy Meal toys. So I was doing them at the same time. The figure, the Playmates stuff, and the Happy Meal stuff, as well as, smaller companies. Because like I say, there were only 10, 12 sculptors nationwide doing this work. So, I mean, if you imagine this, I was actually turning work away. Imagine that.
I had previously spoken to David Arshosky on this podcast. Did he work for you?
Yeah, he was a staff member of mine. Huh?
Oh, cool. Okay.
He may have been the first artist that I hired. I hired mold makers and casting personnel. But at some point, I ran into Arshosky at a comic convention, Comic-Con, I guess, in San Diego. And I remember he was sitting on the steps drawing drawings and selling them. People were coming up and saying, draw me a bird or something. He was drawing them. So I said, hey, you want to come learn to sculpt and work for me? And of course, he had already sculpted. He just hadn't done any actual toys.
Sure.
Yeah, Arshosky, I always thought of him as kind of my left field staff member. Because if we were trying to solve an artistic problem, you would ask Dave, and he would always come up with some wild idea that you would never have thought of. It wasn't always great, but when it was great, it was really great. And he was really fast. It was hard to duplicate his style because it was so out there. But he was part of the mix. I had another guy named Steve who only worked in clay. He didn't like working in wax at all. So he tended to have him start the things in clay, and then the rest of us would finish them. And when I say the rest of us, like I said in my email to you, it was a sculpture studio. So everybody in the studio worked on everything, really. They were all there to help me because theoretically I was hired because the client liked my style and I was there doing the sculpture. But what I would do is I would assign a piece to one of the sculptors and I would watch them go. And if I liked what they were doing, I just let them go. If I didn't like what they were doing, I'd take it away from them, give them something different, and give the piece to a different guy. And we would trade them all around like that. And in the end, I would work on them to finish them and make sure they all have the same kind of studio look. So that's why.
I remember when talking to David Arshosky, speaking of left field,
the pizza chef, Pizza Face.
Oh yeah, that's that one I meant. Yeah,
And it had this infamous other head hidden under the hat, which
right.
eventually they did away with. But that's one of the most, like, I don't know, to diehard Turtle fans, that's like an infamous sculpt, is the would-be two-headed Pizza Face. So
Yeah, it was cool. There was also something else about that piece. He has a spring in his arm, and he can throw the pizzas like discs or like frisbees.
Oh.
And if you look at the figure, he's missing his pinky.
Yes.
I don't know why I remember this, but I remember we did it without a pinky because, you know, he had a knife and he was chopping and stuff. And then Dave put the pinky on one of the pizzas. The Playmate said, no human fingers in the, no. So they left the cut off pinky, but they took the pinky out. And then they told us the head on top of his head was a costing issue. They said it cost too much to make that piece. I didn't believe them for a second. They just kind of chickened out on that.
It was just too gross.
Yeah, it was just, and it was a lot grosser than anything else in the line that we were doing at the time.
Sure.
There was another piece called Mutant Man.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And that was, well, I like to think it was my idea. It's so long ago, who knows? But yeah, the idea was to have his guts floating in Mutant inside a clear body. What a weird idea.
Oh, it's great. I remember those little plastic yellow parts vividly. That just, yeah.
Yeah, no, it was a fun piece.
Oh yeah,
we were. I mean, I never was. I never was very technical, so I was just guessing. You know, I was just kind of measure and guess to make sure those pieces were going to fit in his body. Didn't really know for sure until it came out in production.
The sculpt on that thing too, it was unpainted, but like if you look at the actual sculpt of it, it was just gruesome. Mutagen Man.
Yeah. The entire the guts and stuff were. Yeah, that was fun.
Now, how did it work? Like, what was the relationship between you and like your studio, Playmates, Mirage? Like, how did it all kind of work?
Well, I'd like to say it was more complex or interesting than it really was, but actually, I had no contact with Mirage at all.
Okay,
I mean, none. And Playmates just hired me and all the other sculptors that they hired just as work for hire freelancers.
Okay.
So it wasn't really very complicated. I mean, I would go in. Those were the days when you would have to take the work into the company and show it to them. Nowadays, nobody wants to see you. They don't say. I mean, I'm not even because of COVID. They just don't want you to come in. They just say, just send us JPEGs. You know.
Sure.
So I almost never go have meetings anymore. Back in the day, it was all about having meetings. It would be me and 5 guys from marketing, trying to talk us into one thing or another.
So you weren't involved in those first 4 Turtles, but you were involved in the villains that came out along with them, correct?
I didn't do the first 4 Turtles. No, Varner did them. I did the first 4 bad guys.
Right.
Actually, the first 3 bad guys, and then I did early studies on the 4th. And then after that, I did pretty much bad guys for a couple of years.
Sure.
And then once they were up and running, then I whined and I went, I want to do some Turtles. So they gave me some Turtles to do. But we ended up with kind of we ended up with kind of a formula for the bad guys. It was kind of fun.
Oh, what's that?
Well, they would, after we ran out of characters from the comic books, they said, okay, now let's do a camel guy. And you would do a camel, and one arm would be a camel, and the other arm would be a human, and one foot would be a camel, and one foot would be a human. And then they say, okay, now a moose, and we would do a moose the same way, and now an elephant, and do it the same way. So it was kind of fun. So on the one hand, it was a formula. On the other hand, we were making stuff up as we went along. So there was a lot of imagination there. Another interesting thing is that later on, I would see figures that we had designed show up in the comic books and on the TV show. At the time, I just thought it was kind of mildly amusing. Now I realize I should have been getting paid, but okay. I was happy to be working.
You were saying like there's a certain style to the studio. I mean, what went into that aside from that asymmetry? Just what we're talking about. Like, is there a way to kind of define what that style was for the villains, or?
What the style was? Well, it was basically mine. Not to sound too full of myself.
No, not at all. Yeah.
But I had a certain way of working. which was kind of a balls out, make it up as you go along kind of style. So if you're doing it that way, it's not going to come out symmetrical because I'm just winging it,
Sure.
Later on, 4 or 5 years into it, I had a model shop and 4 or 5 guys who just worked in the model shop, and they could build me armatures and stuff to do the work on top of. And then things got straighter because I wasn't doing it myself.
Okay.
Dave was the same way, though. Dave was pretty much just close the door on him and see what he could come up with. He's
Sure.
a pretty crazy guy. I mean, sculptors are sometimes, they seem to be either way. They seem to be very anal and into every little textural detail, or kind of, yeah, it works that way too. It looks good that way,
Sure.
And when you compare the Turtles to, say, the Kenner Star Wars stuff, or even the Mattel He-Man stuff, I mean, they were much, much more studied, or Hasbro even. They were much more studied, and they were looking a lot closer. Because Playmates really didn't have a marketing. I mean, they really didn't have an art department. I mean, they had some artists on staff, but they farmed it all out. So if they were going to farm it to me, then they had to live with my version of it. They generally didn't nitpick them very much. They would kind of slow me down sometimes if I was, putting a second head on a pizza guy. They would say, a little crazy there. Slow up with that. Or if they were getting too big sometimes. Or I remember doing a dragon once, and I decided that his neck should come out of his body, so he got even bigger.
Yes.
And I had to sell him on that because that was a more expensive piece to make.
Sure. That was a hell of a figure when I was a kid. That Hothead's head being pulled out. That was a hell of a
head. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that was cool. Or I did a snake. It was like his body was sectioned.
Yes.
So that you could hold the tail and make it look like it was, crazy ideas. And we would just, talk them through, and they would say, yeah, go ahead and try that. I don't remember ever doing one where they rejected it. They would always take them and make them work.
That snake, Scale Tail.
Oh, right.
One of my favorite villains. And he never appeared anywhere else, but it's just a great toy, that one.
Yeah, they were a lot of fun. Playmates was and still is a Chinese-owned company.
Mm-hmm.
So we would make the prototypes and then send them into the company. And then they would send them off to, I would say Hong Kong, like it's the entire nation, but it would send them off to Asia. And those guys would make them work. Whereas Mattel and Hasbro and everybody else would do the engineering in town, make sure they liked it, and then send it off. So there was a certain amount of freedom there. Because I was used to working for manufacturers that would be very close in what they wanted done, and they would have a plan. Playmates didn't really seem to have a plan. Like, in contrast with that's cruel. I didn't mean that. They had a plan. I just didn't tell me about it. The Happy Meals, see, were the complete other side of the story. Each one of those pieces had to be producible for 37 cents each of the little toys.
Sure.
So I had to be very careful how big they were because of safety constraints, and how complicated they were because of costing, and they were all very closely looked at, as opposed to Playmates, on the other hand, who we would make it, and I'd say, well, I'm not sure how I'm going to connect the arm around this shoulder piece. And they would say, I just send it to Hong Kong, they'll figure it out. And they always did. We did some really large insects. I remember there was a big mosquito.
Yep.
And there was a big bee, I think.
Yep.
Killer bee. I think killer bee. They were like that big, and the figures, the turtles were fairly big. So the figures they were going to ride had to be even bigger. So I sculpted those guys. Dave worked on both of them too. And I said, yeah, but how do you want to draft? How do you want the parts to come out of the mold here? Because these body sections are big and complex. And like I say, they would say, we'll just send it off and they'll figure it out. So they elected to make those things out of solid vinyl. If you ever see one of those pieces, they're really heavy because if you sawed them in half, solid vinyl, not hollow styrene or anything. I don't think you could do that and make it pay nowadays. I think the vinyl's too expensive.
Oh, wow. I have both, but I had never realized that they were a different material. I just knew they were bigger.
No, they're the same. That's my point. They're the same material.
Oh, okay, I see.
But they're solid.
Right.
And they were making choices just to get these things. I always imagined that because they were selling them so fast that the speed of getting them on the shelf was the most important thing.
Sure.
But it was fun. Like I say, there was a certain amount of freedom working there.
Sure.
That.
Going back to those original 3 or 4 villains, I'm curious, just to get into the gritty details, if you happen to remember. Bebop has a leg brace. Do you know why that is? I've been curious about that for maybe since I've recognized it. So.
Well, when I first started working on Turtles for Playmates, there was a guy named John Handy who was in charge. He later went away and he went over to Mattel. And another guy came to take over for him, and his name was Mark Taylor. And Mark Taylor was doing sketches for me. I mean, we weren't just making them up. He did turnarounds for me. It was later that we were making them up. Those first ones were pretty well sketched out. So my answer is, I'm sure it was Mark Taylor's idea.
Cool.
Those details, because I was copying, his drawings were really good. I was copying them everywhere I could. I imagine he got them from the comic, but I don't know. But yeah, he would do all these turnarounds and stuff for me. I remember working on Bebop, and I was very proud of myself the way I got the shoulders on, because each shoulder has a turtle shell on it, like a football shoulder thing. And when they turn into a slot as they go. They're not flat. And I remember being so proud of that. No one ever noticed it, but I knew it was there. I thought it was pretty good. Because back then we were trying to hide the articulations. We were trying to, where the body met the arm. We were trying to hide that line so it looked more lifelike and real. As time went on, we kind of gave up on that because it was extra effort. We just started making sure they fit together okay.
Where you were saying you did a Rocksteady concept. Was that the big-headed Rocksteady that we never got?
Right.
That one is also very well beloved. It's such a cool looking design.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah. I think I did that right out of the comic. I think there's a big rhino guy in one of the comics, if I remember right.
I think the way those were mistaken is that because those characters didn't pre-exist in the comics, but I think with whatever the cartoon was doing, they were also sending concepts by guys like Steve Levine and Ryan Brown and stuff like that from Mirage, I think. So those were cartoon, but it's weird because the cartoon and especially those earlier toys, a lot of them don't resemble each other that much. And I guess, why is that? Why don't they look that much like each other, out of curiosity?
What do you mean?
The earliest toys and what you see in the cartoon, like Shredder's dressed very differently. There's a character named General Trag, the rock general, who looks nothing like the show. And it's curious, the relationship, it made the toy line its own awesome thing. But I was just curious about, is it because the designs changed the cartoon and the toys were started earlier? Do you know why that was?
No, I think we were just playing it fast and loose. We weren't worrying too much about the source material, It wasn't like doing, later on I did some pieces for, I guess it was Kenner. Yeah, must have been. For the Star Wars people. And those guys, they were close. I'm in Northern California, so they're close to me. So I drove over there and went inside, and they were, I'm trying to think of a polite way of putting it, they were just very into how their stuff looked.
Sure.
And they wanted them all to be very consistent. Even though George Lucas didn't care about consistency at all, these guys really cared as far as the toys were concerned. And Playmates just had a completely different view of it. They were just like, they're toys. Let's not worry about it. Let's just make a toy, sell it for a cheap price, and make another one. One of the reasons I think the Turtles did so well is because they were selling them for, what was it, $2.99, $3.99, something like that. They were cheap, so kids could afford them.
Sure. Oh yeah. I still have hundreds of them from when I was a kid. So. Yeah. Just to get into the silly details, was Shredder and the Foot Soldier kind of had these awesome, cool, crazy poses of those original lines. And I'm curious why maybe that was.
Oh, I didn't bring that story up because I thought you'd probably heard it already. But Mark Taylor and I were working together on coming up with the figures. I was working on the Shredder and the Foot Soldier at the same time because they were kind of buddies, I guess.
Sure.
And in the comic, the Shredder towers over the turtles. He's super tall. He's like twice as tall as they are, and he's very thin. They were kind of trying to do a karate body type instead of the muscular He-Man. They were trying to do a very thin guy. So we did this big thin Shredder. It looked just like the Shredder we have now, except he was standing straight up and he was very tall. And the marketing department said, "Oh no, you can't do that. We've already got the blister cards decided on. You got to make them so they fit on the card." So, and we didn't want to resculpt him. Me and Mark didn't want to resculpt him to make him shorter because that's not an imposing bad guy. It's got to be scary. So we just crunched him over. So I just reposed him until he was low enough that he fit on the blister card. Same thing with the Foot Soldier. That's how he got so crowded and crouched over.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and nobody said anything after that. And then later on, of course, like we say, the dragon guy and the elephant guy and the giraffe guy, they were really tall. But by that time, we could do no wrong at that point.
Sure.
And fortunately for me, and this was a rumor, but the Chinese-owned Playmates folks were very superstitious. And since I had been doing the sculpture for some of the early successful pieces, they said, "Oh, you got to keep using that same sculptor. You can't use any others. You got to use him." And I said, "Right on, bro." I mean, of course, there was Varner and there were other sculptors, but there were primarily the two studios, mine and Varner's.
What was the name of yours again? Forgive me.
Anaglyph.
Okay,
Anaglyph Sculpture, yeah. Anaglyph. And when I formed the company, I chose this name because I thought it was very clever. In Anaglyph, if you're looking at a comic book and you have the two colored glasses and it's making it 3D, it's a 3D thing, that's called an anaglyphic process, anaglyphic comic book. And I thought, oh, that's clever. It's 3D like sculpture, but it's a comic. See, it's both. Somebody else told me that the two A's just looked like breasts, and that's why I liked it. Mostly I regretted it because, of course, nobody could pronounce it or understand it or remember it. But yeah, Anaglyph Sculpture.
Now, so Varner did. You said many of the kind of wacky Turtles costumes. Do you recall? I know you did some of them. Do you recall any particular costume Turtles that stand out to you in your memory? They got goofy after a while.
Yeah, they sure did. I'm trying. I should have brought one of the catalogs out here, but the goofier Turtles. I remember doing some Rockstar Turtles, and
those are great. Yes,
Punk Turtles. And a lot of bad guys. Like there was a gecko guy on a skateboard.
Yep, Mondo Gecko.
And,
he was good. Yes.
Yeah. That reminds me. We also used to do the paint jobs. Called them Deco Masters, and they were there to show the manufacturers in Hong Kong how to paint them. But the costs were very, very tightly watched. So you'd only get, say, 20 paint ops per figure. Each time you hit it with a different color, or even if it's the same color, each time you hit it, that's a paint op, and they count them. So you only get 20 or 15 or something. And we turned in the paint deco for the Mondo Gecko. He had something like 123.
Oh, wow.
He had a ton. He was really beautiful, but they go, "This is great, but we cannot afford to make this. You've got to simplify it." So, and one thing I was going to say about the painted samples on the Instagram you mentioned, some of those we didn't sculpt. Some of those we only painted because I had a bigger paint department than the other studio. So, and to try and keep up with the release, we did a lot of the painting. And then we did some of the design work that we didn't sculpt. Like there was a robot turtle that we designed, but somebody else sculpted.
Oh, cool.
I'm trying to think of some others that filmed it. Muckman, I think, somebody else. We drew it. Dave drew it, and somebody else sculpted it. Yeah. Dave would always come up with these great bad guy names for them, but they would never use our names. The only one they used was one we came up with called Ray Fillet.
Yes.
A mantis guy. Yeah. And he had a panel in his front that had a color changing paint on it. And that was at the time when the color changing paint just came out and everybody was excited. We were trying to use it.
I remember using that color change thing. It was like the most amazing feature to me.
Yeah, it was very cool. As I understand it, you have a color and then you paint you coat it with the color changing, and then when you put it in the warm water, it goes clear, revealing the color under it. So that's how it's not really changing, it's just kind of revealing. But that was fun. Oh, but yeah, so they actually, I remember the king shit from Playmates actually calling me up, which was rare. And he said, we want to use the name you had on the piece, Ray Fillet. Can we use it and everything? I said, yeah, sure. Later on, I found out I should have charged him for that. But intellectual property, But like I say, I was just happy to be working.
For sure, yeah.
Just like today. By the way, I am still working. Just in case you wonder, I'm not retired. I'm still sculpting.
What are you working on now?
Well, I was afraid you were going to ask me that. I'm doing a lot of Star Trek figures.
Okay.
But I'm doing them for a private guy. And he just has me making them, and he's just putting them on the shelf. He's not even going to production. I know that sounds strange. And it sounds strange to me, too. But work is work. And sure. He's a very wealthy, very famous guy. So he just wants to art direct, which is, whatever. Art department, remember, I'll take whatever you got. So I'm doing that, and then I did a figure. Joe Bob Briggs, I think, was the guy. He was an old TV host type guy, and that actually saw production from a company called Plastic Meatball. And then there's not so much call for action figures anymore because kids don't play with action figures; they play with video games. Don't need sculptors for that. But so I was doing other things. I was doing stuff for a Halloween mask making company.
Okay.
Doing various things for them. And that'd be funny too, because they don't even have an art department. The owner would call me up and say, I need a zombie rat. Make it 3 inches tall. I need it by Friday. And that'd be it. I'd sculpt him a zombie rat, make him old, cast it. He's happy. Stuff like that. And then I did a lot of work for Lennox Ceramics. They do porcelain ware. They do a lot of Mickey Mouses and Donald Ducks and Charlie Browns and Snoopies.
Okay.
That's kind of fun. They're designing for ceramic ware is completely different from designing for plastic, because you're actually not making a toy. You're making a pattern for a toy. You got to make it so that the guys who are producing the parts, are happy with you. So you've got to worry about draft angles and shrink rates and screw bosses and stuff. And if you're working for ceramic ware, you just kind of make the sculpture and then they figure out how to mold it and cast it and take it apart. So it's all sculpture, but it's all fun. And I always feel like my job is to render the cartoon or the turnarounds as closely as I can. I'm not really there to change it or add my own style to it. I'm there to render what the company wants. That's real different from Playmates, because they wanted us to think up weird stuff, which was, that's fun. It's a fun thing to do. It's a little bit, it makes you a little insecure because you never really know. If you're rendering Mickey Mouse and it's done and you know what Mickey Mouse looks like, then it's done right. And so shut up and give me another job. But if you're just making it up as you go, maybe they like it, maybe they don't. And some things are more academic. I did the sculpture for Playmates after the King Kong movie came out, the Peter Jackson movie.
Okay.
So I did a bunch of dinosaurs and weird bug monsters and, of course, gorillas. And once you do the gorilla right, then you just kind of rendering in different poses, and it's a much more comfortable place to be because you're not putting your artistic self out there. You're just doing the work.
Sure.
But whatever pays. I guess I said that enough.
I'm curious, just to kind of get to some of my favorite toys. There is a kangaroo named Walkabout that came out later in the line. Did you guys make that one?
Yeah, that was us. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, that was fun. I remember because they would leave stuff up to us as to how to make it work. So I remember suggesting a kind of a side-by-side knee split articulation. Splits like that instead of front to back like a knee usually does, it's side to side. If you look at your collection, you'll see what I mean.
Sure.
And then the little guys, they always came with a little buddy. Not always, but a lot of times they came with a little buddy.
Yeah.
And back to Warshawski again, he was king of the little buddies. I would just say, Dave, go do your thing. And that little buddy had to come out of the mold in two ways. It couldn't be complex. It had to be more simple. So it would draft with just a single parting line down the center.
Sure.
And that's not an easy thing to learn. And some people can never learn it. And then, so you have to be able to make it interesting and producible at the same time. So if you look at the little buddies, that's generally what they'll be.
Yeah, that little wallaby with a bow staff. Yeah, he kind of doesn't all stand in a straight line now that I think about it, for sure.
Yeah. But if you look at the other ones too, I mean, let's see, I always loved the ones he would do. There was a bat guy, one of the earlier bad guys.
Oh yeah, Wingnut with screw loose, the little mosquito.
Right. And Dave did a little mosquito. He's a very complex pose, but he drafts. I think I had to show him for the first few times what we wanted to do, but after that, off and running. I could never get him to paint the little guys. They would always just be one color, but kids don't care about that kind of thing.
No. The little buddies were always these great little characters that came with them, and they were always, perfect little sidekicks for those guys. So
yeah, I think they started as accessories. They started as a gun and a rifle and a spear. And we said, well, can't we do a little character as well? And they said, if you can make it so we can afford it, you can do it. So those were good.
Oh, very cool. Let's see here. I wanted to ask you also, do you know about Scratch, the cat, the jailbird cat?
Sure, that was one of mine, yeah.
Okay, cool. Which ended up being, I don't know if I'm sure you probably know this, like the rarest turtle figure ever.
Well, yeah, I know that it all exciting about the cat with the you're talking about the one with the stripes.
Yes,
he's in the convict outfit. Yeah. I remember doing it. I remember painting it.
Cool. Do you remember anything that went into that at all, or?
I don't remember anything too specific. I mean, like I say, that was towards the end of that section of work, and they weren't watching it too closely. I don't remember even doing any drawings. They said, just do a cat burglar in a convict suit. So, bang it out.
I remember at one of my brief entries into adulthood when I thought I would grow out of this stuff, I had Scratch the cat, sold it, regretted it, and then bought it back for more money.
There you go. That's a true collector there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had an original paint sample of that around for a while. I don't know what happened to it. When back in the day, we would finish the piece in wax, make a silicone mold, cast urethane resin parts. We would make usually 3 painted samples that we would call Deco Masters. And the factory would keep one, and they would send one off to the manufacturing company, and the third one they would use for trade shows as a sales sample, a display sample. Sometimes they'd use them in the TV commercials. So what I would do is, while the mold was there, I would cast a second, or I guess it would be a fourth copy for myself. I called it a shop copy. So for the longest time, I had all these little piles of pieces sitting around. And then when we would get real slow, I would have the mold makers or the casters clean them up and assemble them, and I'd have the painters paint them. So I ended up with a whole lot of pieces as kind of a portfolio brag wall thing. If you're an artist, you're always insecure about your next job. So I had to have this big portfolio wall because I thought that's going to get me the next gig. And I did actually take some to some trade shows myself and try and get work that way. So I set them all up as a big display. But then nobody looks at your portfolio anymore. Nobody cares. They just want to see your website. They don't want to see pros. So I had mounds of these things in a storage unit. So I gave them away or sold them or something, But that would be a good one. If I could just, here's Scratch, if I could just pull that out, you'd blow it.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I don't have too much around anymore. That's all right.
Let me see here. I wanted to ask you about, Casey Jones was another one. Did you work on the original Casey Jones?
Yeah, in fact, that was before I hired people. So that was all me. Casey Jones was all me. And he had a second head.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that.
Well, they couldn't decide how they wanted to finish it, whether they wanted to do a figure with a face and then make a mask that pops on, or they couldn't figure out what to do. So I just did a head, and then I did another head with a mask on. And they just decided to just go with the mask. Kind of surprised me because it doesn't have as much personality as would with a face. But I think in the comic book, he has the mask on almost all the time. So
Yeah.
it makes sense from that standpoint. Yeah. The funny thing about that, if I can tell a story, a couple of years ago, I was invited to go be a celebrity. I was like, wow, well, I'm not really interested in being a celebrity. And this was in a place in Mexico City. There's a show called the Unboxing Convention. I think they had done maybe 2 or 3 of them, maybe 4 of them, before they invited me to come be there. And I was like, well, I'm not crazy about airplanes, and I don't want to be a celebrity. And they said, we'll pay you. And I said, oh, okay. So art department. So I went down there, and they lined all the celebrities up along the wall. They had the guy who played the Gamorrean guard in Star Wars. They had the guy who played Darth Maul in Star Wars. And then they had some people who worked from Mattel that did the Monster High line.
Okay.
And so there were a few other people. And it was the show wasn't a Comic Con, which was everything pop star. It was strictly about toys. When you said Casey Jones, that's what reminded me. Because they thought I had only done Casey Jones. They thought it was the only one I ever done. I don't know what gave them that idea, but they made this vinyl poster that was probably 15 feet tall. Everybody got one, but mine was a 15-foot tall Casey Jones figure. And I was like, well, I mean, I'm proud of it. That's a good piece, but that's a strange idea that someone would be that famous for just doing one piece.
Sure.
Anyway, they used that big poster in the ad. I didn't see the ad, but apparently they did. So people were coming in with their Casey Jones figure and standing in line, and I was signing them. And then when I told them I had done other figures too, they went home and got those figures and came back and got back in line, and I was signing them. Weird. I'd never signed a figure before, but that was kind of fun. And in Mexico City, the thing to do was have them sign it, and then they would take your picture with you, So there's lots of pictures of me out there in Mexico City with Casey Jones behind me.
Out of curiosity, that other face, was that based on Clint Eastwood?
No, it does kind of. I've seen pictures of it recently. It did. He has kind of a squint.
Sure. Yeah.
But not really. No, I just made one up one day.
Cool.
Faces are faces. They're all acceptable. They're all different.
Sure.
So the first one I made was I just took to the guys and said, "How about this?" And they said, "Great." So, yeah. I put more time into probably the posing. He had that weird bow-legged pose with the arms and the wrists and the hair on his arms and stuff. Spent a lot of time on that, really.
I never realized how, maybe until many years later, how detailed he was. He had all this hair, this body hair sculpted into him perfectly, but you never realized how, I don't know, I never realized the level of detail on so many of them too, because they're, so often unpainted. So.
Yeah. You know, a lot of those pieces were resculpted. I did an alligator guy.
Yes.
He was kind of crouching over and stuff.
Yep.
And he was fine, alligator guy. And then when he came out in production, I was looking at it and I was saying, you know, is that really? So I pulled out the wax and I was comparing it, and pretty much all the strokes were there, but they were all just a little bit different. In other words, someone had resculpted them. I don't know why. The tool makers decided that they needed to make changes, and they don't really show unless you look really, really close. A lot happened in production that I'm not aware of.
Sure.
Because I'm here and they're there, you know.
Out of curiosity, do you have a favorite, like, crazy mutant character that you did?
I wouldn't say I have a favorite, really. Some of the pieces were more successful than others. I do remember really liking the elephant guy.
Sure. Dr. L, yeah.
Dr. L. Yeah. There was a famous basketball player named Dr. L at the time, I think. And that's why they called him that.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I don't follow basketball, but that was why. But of course, they spelled it E-L, so that was the joke. I remember thinking that the foot soldier looked pretty cool after I finished him.
Oh, yeah.
You know, because he was Taylor drew him really asymmetrical. His head wasn't straight; it had his bump up on one side and stuff. And I copied it pretty closely, and everybody else seemed to like it. So I guess that's why I liked it. And I liked Wingnut, right?
Yes, that.
Right, the bat guy. Because some of the stuff was like, if you look close at his wings, for example, he has these big metal wings, and then you look on the back, and he has these little atrophied little organic wings that are kind of strapped onto the back.
Yes.
And I just came up with that on the spot. I mean, I didn't think anybody was going to like it. I just kind of threw that detail on there, and nobody ever said anything about it. So I said, "Oh, that's the way we're playing, huh?" So.
Oh, that's funny, because that was worked into his character later in the Archie comic books. He had these crappy little wings,
yeah,
that he could barely fly with, and the metal wings are kind of stacked on top. That's so funny. I had no idea.
Yeah, and I liked that big grin on Ray Fillet, that big smile of his, and I always like a piece that stands up really well, and that piece had flippers on his feet, so he stands up really well. So, I don't know if that qualifies as a favorite, but.
Especially the turtles. You know, their feet weren't huge, so with the 1 foot back and all that, you always had to make sure you posed it just right without them falling down.
Yeah, and that was kind of an ongoing question, because when we were doing the Star Trek figures, they were mostly just guys in pajamas. You know, all basically looked the same. We're trying to find ways to make them look different, but they were basically all the same. But they stood up well because the first release, notwithstanding, they were mostly just standing in the universal pose. But years later, we did a line about skeleton warriors.
Yes, those are great toys.
Thank you. And most of them, I did the skeletons. Varner did the humans, and they didn't stand up with shit. I mean, because they were all taking a big step and they didn't have much feet. Not much rubber on the road. But I guess we decided, kids don't care. So I don't know how much kids care. But of course, after I finish them, they always stand up really well.
Sure.
And then in production, all it takes is just a little bit of a tweak and down they go. But I always say there's standing and then there's balancing. You can balance a drinking straw or a pencil. I mean, you can balance it, but that's not really standing. It's going to fall over as soon as there's a little air movement, So I was always trying to pump up the feet to make them stand up better.
Oh, okay. I think that covers it. I really just had one. Well, let me ask you, is there any sort of toy that was not produced that you wish was, turtle-wise?
I don't think there was any that didn't get produced. I mean, like I was saying, anything that they could put in a turtle package would sell, so they pretty much make them all. There were a lot of them that got made that I wished hadn't been made.
Okay, give me one.
Well, I mean, there were just some butt ugly pieces. We did like a Nazi pig guy, which was
yes, okay,
like, oh my God, I can't believe you want to do that, let alone actually release it. Or there were some other ones that the heads would spin around in the body. So there would be a head inside the body and you push a button and another head would pop up. But to make that work, you had to make the body big and bloated and stupid looking. And I was just always embarrassed by some of these pieces. That's all. I just wanted to complain a little bit.
I feel like some of the ones that were like transforming or action features never quite look the way you want it to.
Yeah. Well, you'd have to start with an armature that was ugly to start with and then decorate on top of that. I mean, it was a job, but it wasn't really any fun. The fun ones were the monster-y bad guys, the gecko and stuff. I really like those.
Here's a question for you now, because specifically about those toys. So Bebop, who was the pig guy, the transforming one of him, in the cartoon, he was black. And in the toy, he was a red-haired white guy. And it always bugged me. Do you have any idea why that was? I'm just curious.
No, I'm sure it was marketing department, you know.
Sure.
We were all working for the marketing department. So,
sure.
So if that's the case, then they get all the blame.
You know, I'm not sure.
I remember that.
Go ahead. Well, now, did you work on there was unproduced Star Wars Turtles. Did you work on those or no?
No, that would have been Barney. Yeah. I worked on the Star Wars, but not Turtle Star Wars. They'd have gotten around to that eventually. But, you know, the Star Wars figures got Baroque the same way. And when we started doing Western Star Wars and, you know, Star Trek. Okay. The same way. I mean, clearly they were starting to run out of ideas with the turtles and there was a line of dinosaur turtles.
Yep.
And, you know, Western turtles and stuff. I mean, they're all fun toys. They were fun to do. I'd like to do some more someday.
The last one I wanted to ask you, and I ask this of everybody, even if you don't have one, that's okay. But do you have a favorite Ninja Turtle?
You mean out of the four guys?
Yeah. You may not. That's okay.
Oh, I don't really, because I think of them all kind of as the same guy. I mean,
sure.
oh, what did I just say? But yeah, they were the same guy with different outfits on. So
that's fine. From a design standpoint, they certainly were. So
yeah.
You know, honestly, Scott, I appreciate talking to you. Thanks so much for being here. This is great.
Oh, it was fun. Nice to talk to you. Nice to meet you, Brian.
You too, Scott. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Take care.
Splinter the Rat taught them each the ninja arts. Donatello, master of the staff. War! Leonardo, the katana blade. My God! Raphael, the sleeve. Don't throw this at home, kids! And Michelangelo, the nunchakus.
Radical! And master of the willing pizza.
Hey, who had the pepperoni and ice cream?
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. From Playmates.